If you're about to watch one of the most incredible aerial combat stories from World War II, you absolutely need to be subscribed to this channel. We release untold stories of aviation heroism, tactical brilliance, and split-second decisions that changed history every single week. Hit that subscribe button now and the notification bell because you won't want to miss what's coming. Let's dive in. The morning of June 19th, 1944, breaks over the English Channel with a low, bruised sky, the kind that makes pilots grip their yokes a little tighter. At Boxted Air Base in Essex, Flight Lieutenant James Carver walks across the dispersal toward his Hawker Tempest 5, and the British mechanics are already going through the pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. The aircraft, serialed NV-724, sits gleaming with fresh invasion stripes painted on the wings and fuselage. Those stripes still smell of drying paint. Carver runs his hand along the leading edge of the wing as he approaches, a ritual he's performed before every mission since he first took command of this bird 6 months ago. The Tempest is a beautiful machine, low-slung and aggressive, with a liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Griffon engine that purrs when it's happy and screams when it's angry. Today, Carver suspects, it will scream. The squadron is conducting a dawn patrol over the Normandy beachhead, a combination sweep and escort for medium bombers hitting supply depots inland from the beaches. The invasion, now nearly 2 weeks old, has settled into a grinding campaign of air superiority battles, ground attack runs, and the constant grinding pressure of maintaining control of the skies above the lodgement. The Germans are not giving up easily. Their Luftwaffe presence remains sharp, concentrated, and increasingly desperate. They've thrown everything they have at the beaches, Focke-Wulfs, Messerschmitts, and, most troublingly in recent weeks, a new generation of fighters that fly faster than anything the Allies have yet encountered in sustained combat. The Me-262, the jet. Carver finishes his walk around and climbs into the narrow cockpit. The smell hits him immediately. Hot oil, glycol coolant, fresh canvas from the new fuselage panels, and something else. Something like ozone or burnt metal that never quite washes out of a fighter cockpit. His knees fold tight against the instrument panel. He settles into the seat, reaching for the straps. The crew chief, Sergeant Morris, a hawk-faced man with sharp eyes and steadier hands than most pilots, assists with the harness, buckling Carver in with professional efficiency. They've flown together for 8 months now, and they've developed the kind of shorthand understanding that comes from trusting each other with your life on a regular basis. "She's running rough on the starboard bank, sir," Morris says, leaning in close so Carver can hear him over the rising noise of other engines turning over across the field. "I think it's fouling on the new plugs we installed. Should clear up once she's warm." Carver nods, filing that information away. The Griffon is a temperamental beast, magnificent but fussy. It demands the right mixture, the right temperature, the right amount of respect. Fly it smoothly, and it will take you anywhere you need to go. Abuse it, and it will punish you with dropped cylinders and overheating when you least want it. The radio crackles to life. All Tempest squadrons, stand by for engine start. Wind is 280 at 8 knots. Runway 28 available. Repeat, runway 28. Carver runs through the startup sequence. Fuel, cocks on, mixture rich, prop control fine pitch, supercharger to high gear. He reaches for the magneto switches and holds them to the start position. The engine coughs, catches, and the whole airframe begins to vibrate. The propeller blurs into a solid disc, and the nose of the aircraft rocks slightly with each firing cylinder as the Griffon settles into an aggressive idle. Carver watches the manifold pressure and cylinder head temperature climb into the green arc. Everything nominal, everything exactly where it should be. The squadron forms up by flight as they taxi out. 8 Tempests in 2 flights of 4 and a second squadron of 8 more. 16 fighters heading southwest toward the coast. Above them, already established at altitude, are American P-47 Thunderbolts from the 366 Fighter Group flying high cover. The plan is straightforward. Sweep the area from the Seine estuary south to the Bocage country around Saint-Lô. Look for German fighters staging through the forward fields around Évreux and Dreux, and ensure that the bombers hitting the supply concentrations around Alençon have a clear run. It's a mission the RAF and USAF have been flying in various combinations for days now, and they've developed a rhythm around it. Standard patrol altitude, 3,000 feet above the cloud deck at that level, to stay above the flak and below the high-flying Me-262s that have begun making solitary passes through the invasion zone. Carver gets his clearance and feeds the throttle forward. The Tempest accelerates down the runway, the engines roaring, the tail lifting off at the right moment, and the aircraft climbing into the grey English morning with that particular eagerness that Rolls-Royce engines seem to possess. Around him, the other fighters are doing the same, peeling up and forming into 2-ship and 4-ship units with practiced efficiency. They're experienced, these pilots. They've been flying in pairs and flights for so long that they move together like cells of a single organism. The coast appears through the haze. England drops away beneath them, and ahead, the Normandy peninsula spreads out in the murky morning light. A patchwork of grey and green, scarred with roads and interrupted by the tan washes of the beaches where hundreds of ships still press inshore. Carver can see the smoke from naval gunfire even from this altitude, a faint grey pillar rising from inland. The beachhead looks impossibly small, impossibly fragile, like someone has scratched a tiny toehold on an enormous map and is desperately trying to hold on. The radio chatter begins almost immediately. Other squadrons ahead checking in, flak positions being reported, weather observations being exchanged. Carver lets the familiar routine wash over him. At 32 years old, with over 200 combat hours and a growing list of confirmed kills, he's learned to distinguish the static between the important calls. Most of it is noise. The important stuff will cut through. They reach their patrol altitude and spread out into a loose search pattern. Carver flies as number 2 to the flight leader, squadron leader Robert Hemsworth, a taciturn Canadian with cold blue eyes and a mathematical approach to air combat. Hemsworth flies his Tempest with the same precision he does everything else. Instrument flying is clean, his radio calls are brief and clear, his tactical positioning is always considered and deliberate. It's not flashy flying, but it keeps you alive, and it wins fights. The cloud deck below them is broken and irregular, with gaps that open and close like living things as the wind pushes the formations around. Through those gaps, Carver can see the Bocage landscape beneath, the dense hedgerow country that's proving so difficult for the ground forces to advance through. Roads form sinuous lines through the green. A few small towns show their church spires as pale points rising above the trees. It's beautiful, in a quiet way, but Carver knows that beneath that green blanket, men are dying in the hundreds, bleeding out in wheat fields and stone walls and the wreckage of bombed villages. The war has become very personal down there. They've been on patrol for 40 minutes when the radio crackles with an urgent call. All Tempest squadron, bogey high, bandits high, flight of 2 at 11 o'clock, climbing to Angels 25. Carver's head snaps up. Angels 25 meant 25,000 feet. That altitude is where the Me-262s typically operate. The jets can cruise at altitude and dive down on unwary fighters like hawks diving on sparrows. The tactic is becoming increasingly common as the Germans try to preserve their dwindling fighter force by striking and then climbing away to altitude where the piston engine fighters can't follow. Bandits confirmed, another voice cuts through. Vapor trailing at 27,000 feet. Looks like 262s. 2 distinct radar signatures. Hemsworth's voice comes through cool and level. Tempest Squadron, we maintain current altitude. Do not pursue to altitude. Repeat, do not pursue to altitude. American fighters are above. They're in a better position. We hold patrol, watch our 6, and remain ready for any low-level sorties. But Carver has already spotted them. 2 sleek silhouettes, sharp-edged against the murky sky. their engines trailing thin white vapor as they climb through their high-altitude regime. The Me-262 is unmistakable once you've seen it once. The fat fuselage, the engines mounted flush to the wings, the blunt nose. They're beautiful in a terrible way, and they're climbing away from the tempests with complete indifference. At their altitude and with their power, there's absolutely nothing the RAF fighters can do to catch them. But something is wrong with their climb profile. One of the jets, the left one in the two-ship formation, is drifting slightly nose-high, and its rate of climb seems to have fallen off. The right-hand jet continues its steep climb unabated, but the left one is struggling. Carver watches it, fascinated and concerned in equal measure. Is it damaged? Is the pilot new and struggling with the throttle management, or is it something else? The American fighters above have spotted them too. High-flying P-47s from the 366th are already pushing over into a dive, trying to intercept, but at their distance it's going to be close. Too close. The Germans see them coming, and the lead 262 pushes the throttle forward, accelerating in its climb like it's been given a sudden injection of adrenaline. The left-hand jet tries to follow, but it's clearly lagging. "American flight is engaging," the radio calls. "Bandits diving now, they're running." The two jets push over into a shallow dive, their trajectories bending away from the climbing American fighters. They're heading in a rough direction toward the coast, but their initial climb trajectory had taken them inland, over the Bocage country, toward the supply concentrations near Alençon that the bombers are currently attacking. This is not a good situation. Me-262s loose over the bomber stream will cause absolute havoc. Hemsworth makes a decision. "Tempest Squadron, we climb. We climb now and we move inland to position ourselves between these bandits and the bombers. Transition to full military power. Let's move." The whole squadron banks hard to port, the Tempest engines roaring as Carver shoves the throttle to the firewall and cranks the prop control to full RPM. The Griffin responds with a furious howl, and the needle of the rate of climb indicator swings hard into the green. They're climbing at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, an impressive rate for a piston engine fighter, but the Me-262s, even when not at full throttle, will outclimb them. Still, they don't need to catch the Germans. They just need to position themselves in the right place at the right time. The sky is a chaos of movement now. The American fighters above are still trying to run down the 262s, but the jet pilots are flying a tactical game that the American pilots understand. They're going to extend away at altitude, draw the Americans far from the bomber stream, and then, when they're confident that no one can catch them, they'll either turn back for another pass, or they'll head for their own bases to refuel and rearm. It's a cat-and-mouse game that's been playing out across the invasion zone for weeks now. Carver's Tempest, however, is performing magnificently. The climb continues, burning through fuel at an alarming rate, but eating up altitude with every second. They've reached 10,000 feet now, 12,000. The temperatures in the engine bay are climbing toward the limits, and Carver has to fine-tune the mixture and prop pitch continuously to keep everything from overheating. It's demanding flying, the kind of thing that requires constant attention. And then, as if on cue, the left-hand 262 appears through the cloud layer below them. The jet has lost so much energy during its climb that its trajectory has reversed. It's descending now, losing altitude rapidly, its nose dropping as the pilot either realizes he can't keep climbing or he's decided to abandon the high-altitude game and make a run for home at lower altitude, where he might have a better chance of losing pursuit. Whatever the reason, the jet is now descending directly toward the patrol of Tempests, albeit at an angle that will take it past them rather than through them. It's at this precise moment that Carver makes a decision that will, in retrospect, be recognized as either brilliant or suicidally reckless, possibly both. The 262 is still fast, even in a descent. It's traveling at somewhere in the region of 550 miles per hour, which is significantly faster than the Tempest's cruising speed. But Carver knows something about the aerodynamics of fighter aircraft. something he's learned through careful study and through experience. When an aircraft reaches certain speeds, the air behaves differently. The air becomes less like a fluid and more like a solid. Shock waves begin to form. The controls become sluggish. The nose wants to drop. And if you're willing to push hard enough, if you're willing to accept the structural punishment and the loss of control authority, you can do things in that rarefied air that people would think are impossible. Carver rolls the Tempest hard to the right, pulling the stick back and diving after the 262. He's abandoning altitude, abandoning the high ground that he's just spent minutes climbing to achieve. But he's calculating something that very few pilots would have the nerve or the knowledge to attempt. The 262 is in a descent at a relatively shallow angle, but it's bleeding energy, losing speed from its maximum. The Tempest, on the other hand, is about to gain speed in a way that the jets simply cannot match at this point in the engagement. Hemsworth's voice cuts through the radio. "Carver, break off the pursuit. The jet has superior speed and altitude advantage. You cannot catch it." But Carver has already locked onto the concept and he's committed to it. He pushes the stick forward, increasing the dive angle to something steep, something dangerous. The altimeter is unwinding rapidly now. 20,000 feet, 19,000, 18,000. The airspeed indicator begins to climb, 420 miles per hour, 450. 480. The needle is rising faster now, and Carver is pushing the Griffin into territory where it's starting to complain. The manifold pressure is climbing, the engine temperature's climbing, and the airframe is beginning to shudder with a vibration that suggests that the air itself is becoming turbulent against the aircraft's skin. This is compressibility. This is what happens when a piston engine fighter accelerates into a dive steep enough and at low enough altitude that the air pressure rises dramatically, that the air becomes a near solid, that shock waves form on the leading edges of the wings and create aerodynamic forces that were never anticipated by the designers. 510 miles per hour, 540. The Tempest is trembling now, and Carver can feel the control stick becoming heavier in his hands, as though something is pushing back against him. The wing appears to have developed a slight flex, a bowing that shouldn't be there. The engine is screaming, and the prop is vibrating with a frequency that makes the entire aircraft feel like it's going to shake apart. But the 262 is ahead, and it's still decelerating. The jet pilot looks back and sees what's happening, and his reaction is instant. The 262's nose drops harder, and the jet begins to accelerate again, but it can't quite match the velocity that the Tempest is achieving. It's a contest of physics now, and the Tempest, for all its vulnerabilities, has one advantage that the jet does not. In this narrow band of flight conditions, this envelope, where the air is thick enough that a piston engine's traditional advantages become meaningless and where shock waves and compressibility effects begin to dominate the aerodynamic picture, the Tempest's steep dive is generating more speed than the 262's shallower descent, and the jet's jet engine's relatively limited ability to accelerate in this dense air regime. Carver closes on the 262, and for just a moment he's close enough to see the pilot. The German is hunched forward in his cockpit, his hands moving across the throttles and the trim controls, trying to find the exact configuration that will give him the most speed. The jet's nose drops another few degrees, and the 262 accelerates slightly, but it's not enough. Carver fires the Tempest's 4 20mm cannons. The tracers arc through the air between the two aircraft, but they're not hitting. Carver is too low on the curve. His guns are firing from below and behind, and the pipper on his gun sight is leading the target perfectly, but the bullets are passing behind and below the jet's fuselage. Still, the effect is immediate. The 262 pilot sees the tracers, and his eyes widen. This is not supposed to happen. A piston engine fighter is not supposed to be able to match his speed in a dive. The entire point of the Me-262's design is that it can do things that piston engine fighters cannot. It can climb faster, it can run away, it can dictate the terms of any engagement. But Carver has found a crack in that armor. Carver adjusts his dive angle slightly, coming down harder on the stick, and the Tempest responds by accelerating further. The airspeed indicator now reads 560 miles per hour, and the stick is almost immovable. Carver can feel that he's approaching a critical threshold where the aircraft might not respond to his control inputs anymore. The flutter has become more pronounced, and there's a high-frequency vibration running through the entire airframe that suggests that something could fail at any moment. The wings, stressed beyond their design limits, might buckle. The fuselage could develop stress fractures. The tail assembly could separate. Flying this aircraft at this speed and at this angle of attack is courting catastrophe. But Carver has experienced enough close calls, enough moments where everything has felt like it was about to come apart and somehow held together, that he's learned to trust the Tempest construction. These aircraft were designed to be durable, to absorb punishment, to keep flying even when they were damaged. It's built into them, almost by philosophy. British aircraft tend to be overbuilt, designed to handle the kind of rough flying that war demands. He closes on the 262 again, his cannons firing, and this time one of the rounds catches the jet's fuselage. It's a grazing hit, barely drawing blood, but it's enough to convince the German pilot that the game is no longer in his favor. The 262 does the only thing it can do. It brakes hard to the left, pushing the control stick over and pulling hard on the elevators, attempting to transition into a climbing turn that will use its superior power to escape. But this is the moment where things begin to go wrong for the jet pilot. At this speed, in this dense air regime, the control inputs that would normally be gentle suggestions to the aircraft have become demanding, jerky maneuvers that the jet cannot accommodate. The Me-262 starts to stall, its nose wanting to drop, its wings beginning to lose lift. The pilot tries to correct by pushing the throttle further forward, but jets don't respond to throttle changes the way piston engines do. There's lag, there's inertia. By the time the jet engines spool up to their maximum power output, the aircraft is already out of control. Carver watches it happen. He's pushing his own limits at this point. His vision is starting to tunnel slightly from the G-forces of his hard dive, and his arms feel like they're encased in concrete as he struggles to maintain his grip on the stick. But he can see the 262 beginning to depart controlled flight, its trajectory becoming irregular, its wings and fuselage starting to oscillate in what looks suspiciously like a Dutchman roll, a dangerous spin-like condition that occurs when the aircraft loses coordinated flight. The jet pilot makes the correct decision. He backs off the controls. He reduces the G-load on the aircraft, allows it to recover its lift, and he begins a gentle climb to regain altitude. It's the smart move, the professional move, but it also breaks the engagement. The 262 is climbing now, pulling away from Carver's Tempest, which is already beginning its own recovery from the extreme dive as Carver carefully feeds the throttle back and eases the stick position. The instant Carver reduces the power and the G-forces drop, however, the shuddering and vibration begin to decrease. His control surfaces respond again. The aircraft feels solid and controllable. It's as though a demon has been exorcised. The numbers that were screaming red lines just moments ago are already coming back down, the manifold pressure dropping, the engine temperatures easing, the airspeed indicator unwinding. Hemsworth's voice crackles through the radio again. "Carver, that was the most ridiculous piece of flying I have ever witnessed. Check your aircraft for damage immediately. Report status." Carver's hands are shaking as he runs through a quick systems check. Engine temperatures nominal, engine pressure nominal, hydraulic pressure normal, fuel flow normal, trim responsive, flight surfaces responding to his inputs. The only thing that feels wrong is the residual vibration, the feeling in his hands and in his seat that the aircraft has just come through something fundamental and is waiting to shake itself apart now that it's no longer under G-load. Tempest Squadron, this is Carver. Aircraft damage assessment complete. All systems green. No apparent structural damage. Engine running smoothly. There's a pause, and then Hemsworth comes back. Well, that was either the bravest or the dumbest thing I have ever seen a pilot do. You nearly tore your aircraft apart. I know, Carver says quietly, and he does know. He can feel it in his bones, in the way the aircraft is flying, in the way it seems like something fundamental has shifted in the way it responds. He's pushed it to the limit and survived, but he's also aware that it's a limit that probably shouldn't be crossed again. The 262 is now well above them, climbing steadily back toward its optimal altitude. The engagement is over. The jet has escaped. But something has happened in that exchange that matters, something that goes beyond a simple pass and a miss. Carver has proven something to himself, to his squadron, and to the Germans if they're listening, that the Me-262 is not invulnerable, that it can be matched, that it can be surprised, that there are conditions under which a piston-engine fighter can not only hold its own, but can actually get the upper hand. The squadron reforms and continues its patrol. They don't encounter the 262s again that morning. Whether the jets are heading back to their base to refuel and rearm, or whether their pilots have simply decided to call off the engagement and preserve their aircraft for another day, Carver doesn't know. But he knows that something has shifted in the dynamic of the air war over Normandy. The flight eventually turns back toward the English coast. The fuel situation is becoming critical. The extended climb and the dive have burned through reserves faster than anticipated. The bombers have finished their work and are heading back. The weather is deteriorating. It's time to go home. Carver lands his Tempest at Boxted, and Sergeant Morris is waiting for him, his face grave. Morris had heard the radio exchange, had heard Hemsworth's comment about ridiculous flying, and he's already conducting a preliminary inspection of the aircraft as Carver climbs out of the cockpit. The squadron mechanic walks his hands over the wings, examining the paint for stress fractures, running his fingers over the fuselage for signs of damage. What he finds makes him whistle through his teeth. "Sir, you've got fabric tearing on the right wing near the aileron. Looks like the aircraft is starting to lose coherence at the trailing edge. Another 15 seconds at that speed, and you'd have lost control authority. And look here, the fuselage has developed a crack that runs from the forward radio antenna mounting back toward the tail. Not life-threatening, but it's significant." Carver nods, feeling the weight of what he's just done settle over him. He flew an aircraft to the absolute limit of its structural tolerance and came back alive. He beat a Me-262 in a contest where the odds should have been completely against him. But the cost is evident in every crack, every torn piece of fabric, every stressed and damaged component. The debrief is waiting in the intelligence hut. The CO sits across a rough wooden table, maps spread out before him, marking the position where the contact occurred. Hemsworth is there as well, along with the other pilots from the patrol. They're all waiting to hear how Carver did what he did. "Right," the CO says, leaning back in his chair. "Let's walk through it step by step. Squadron Leader Hemsworth, what was the engagement profile?" Hemsworth lays it out in his calm, methodical way. He describes the climb, the sighting of the 262, Carver's decision to pursue, and then he stops and looks at Carver. I'll let Carver explain the physics of what happened next, because I'm still not entirely sure I understand it. Carver takes a breath and begins to explain. He talks about the concept of compressibility, the way that air behaves differently at high speed, the way that shock waves form on aircraft wings. He explains that when you reach certain speeds, somewhere in the region of 550 miles per hour at lower altitudes, the properties of air change. It becomes denser, less yielding. Normal aerodynamic principles begin to break down, replaced by new rules that are governed by supersonic flow around the aircraft's surfaces. The Tempest, he says carefully, is actually better adapted to this regime than the 262. The jet has engines that perform at their best at altitude, where the air is thinner. When you compress the air by diving to sea-level speeds, the jet's performance actually degrades. Its power output doesn't increase proportionally. It's the reverse of what happens with a piston engine. The piston engine, running at full military power, actually improves its performance as the air gets thicker. We're sucking in more air at sea level, burning more fuel and generating more power. The result is that in this narrow band of flight conditions, we can actually match or exceed the jet's speed. But, the CO says, interrupting, you can't sustain that, can you? The aircraft starts to break apart. Yes, Carver agrees. I was pushing beyond the limits of the aircraft's design. The structural failure I experienced, the fabric tearing, the fuselage cracks, that's what happens when you exceed the design envelope. The forces acting on the airframe exceed what the designers anticipated. A few more seconds, and the wing might have torn off. The tail might have failed. If I'd misjudged by even a little bit, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. The CO leans forward. So you're saying that what you did was essentially a calculated gamble based on a theoretical understanding of aircraft aerodynamics? Yes, sir, Carver says. But it's a gamble that only works once. The 262 pilot won't fall for it again. Next time, he'll anticipate the dive, he'll manage his energy differently, and he might turn the tables on us. This maneuver works as a surprise, as an unconventional response to an unconventional threat. But it can't be the standard playbook. The intelligence officer, a thin-faced major named Ashford, has been writing notes throughout this exchange. He looks up now. The implications of this engagement are significant. If the Tempest can match the 262's speed in certain conditions, and if that fact becomes known to other pilots, it could change the entire tactical picture of the air war. It could, Carver agrees, but only if pilots are willing to push their aircraft to the absolute limit and accept the consequences of doing so. Not every pilot will be comfortable with that level of risk, and not every aircraft will survive it. The debrief continues for another 30 minutes, working through the details of the engagement, analyzing the 262's behavior, and discussing implications for future tactics. By the time they're finished, Carver is exhausted in a way that goes beyond the simple fatigue of flying. He's emotionally and mentally drained from the intensity of the engagement and from the realization of how close he came to catastrophe. He walks back to his quarters as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon. The English summer is in full swing, and the evening light has that long golden quality that seems to make even a wartime RAF base look almost pleasant. But Carver can't shake the feeling that he's touched something fundamental today, something that has changed the calculus of the air war in ways that neither he nor anyone else fully understands yet. That night, he lies in his bunk and thinks about the 262 pilot. Did the German realize how close he came to being shot down? Is he sitting in his own bunk somewhere in France, on the other side of the lines, thinking about the Tempest that matched his speed and made him question everything he thought he knew about the capabilities of piston-engine fighters? Or is he simply grateful that he escaped, that he made it back alive, and that he'll get another chance tomorrow? Sleep comes fitfully, punctuated by dreams of diving aircraft and shuddering control surfaces, and the moment when speed and fear and determination all collide in a single crystalline point of absolute engagement. 2 weeks pass. Carver flies 3 more patrol missions over Normandy, and each one blurs into the others. Bouncing fighter formations, chasing bandits that disappear into cloud layers, escorting bombers, strafing targets of opportunity on the ground. The air war has become a grinding daily affair. The German Luftwaffe is still present, still fighting, but it's become clear that the Allies have achieved a form of air superiority that, while not absolute, is comprehensive enough that German aircraft cannot operate with impunity anymore. Carver's encounter with the 262 has become something of a legend within the wing. Other pilots have heard the story, and it's begun to circulate through RAF channels. Some embrace it as proof that the Me-262 is not invincible, a story that sustains them in the grinding day-to-day of flying against German fighters. Others dismiss it as a one-off, a freak occurrence that depended on exact conditions and precise piloting skill that can't be replicated. Carver himself maintains a careful silence about it, not wanting to oversell the significance or to encourage other pilots to attempt the same maneuver and risk losing aircraft and lives in the attempt. But on the morning of July 4th, everything changes. Carver is leading Yellow Flight on what's supposed to be a routine patrol. The weather is better today. High clouds, good visibility, a westerly wind that's fresh without being disruptive. The squadron is supporting a tactical bombing run by American B-25s hitting a rail junction near Évreux. It's the kind of mission that's supposed to be straightforward. Fly the patrol, keep the German fighters away from the bombers, return to base when the fuel situation becomes critical. The contact comes at 11:15 hours. A report of bandits inbound from the southeast, climbing toward the bomber stream. Not one jet this time, but potentially two, possibly three. The radio reports are vague, the controller trying to interpret blips on the radar screen and translate them into words that make tactical sense. Hemsworth, flying as Blue Leader, gets the call first. All Tempest squadrons, Vector 270, climb to Angels 20,000. Bandits inbound. German fighters climbing to intercept. Let's go. Carver banks hard, pushing the Tempest into a climb that puts the G-meter in the yellow arc. This is different from the routine climbs. This is aggressive, desperate, racing to get altitude before the enemy gets there first. Around him, the other Tempests are doing the same, their engines roaring, their props beating at the air in full military power configuration. They're at 15,000 feet when Carver spots the first one, not a 262 this time. It's a Focke-Wulf 190, a conventional piston-engine fighter that's nonetheless a formidable adversary, fast, agile, well-armed, and flown by a pilot who clearly knows what he's doing. The German fighter is slightly below them and to the west, moving fast and flat, clearly heading for the bomber stream to cause as much damage as he can before running for home. But there's another aircraft on the radar controller's scope, and a moment later, Carver spots it too. Coming in from a higher angle, descending at a steep angle, its silhouette distinctive and unmistakable against the brightening sky. Another Me-262. Tempest Squadron Yellow, Carver calls. I see a Bandits East, FW-190 low, Me-262 high. They're going to bracket the bombers. I'm engaging the fighter first. The American fighters can handle the jet. Break, you take the upper element. Carver rolls hard to the left, pulling the Tempest into a vertical bank and then feeding in back pressure on the stick. The G-forces climb, and his vision begins to compress slightly as blood is pulled away from his brain by the centripetal acceleration. But the pain centers him, focuses him. He's done this before. He knows how to fly at the edge of consciousness. The FW-190 pilot spots the Tempest and immediately brakes, turning hard to the left in a move that's meant to compel Carver to overshoot. It's a good move, a classic fighter tactic, but Carver has anticipated it. Instead of following the brake, he pulls harder on the stick, using the superior turning performance of the Tempest to compress the turn circle, trading altitude for position. They're in a furious horizontal turning fight now, both pilots standing on their rudder pedals, pulling every ounce of G-force they can extract from their aircraft. The landscape below them wheels and shifts as they trade altitude and position. Carver can see the German pilot in the other cockpit now, hunched forward in his seat, his hands working the stick with visible intensity. This is a pilot who knows what he's doing. This is not an inexperienced kid. This is a seasoned veteran. They complete a full circle of turns, both aircraft getting progressively lower as they trade altitude for a tactical advantage that neither of them quite achieves. The FW-190 is turning slightly more tightly, The German aircraft has a tighter turning radius than the Tempest, but the Tempest is climbing slightly faster out of the turns, and that makes the difference. Carver positions himself for a shot. He's on the German's 6 o'clock now, at about 250 meters range. He opens fire with his 4 cannons, and the tracers arc through the air. The German sees them and immediately brakes hard to the left again, rolling the FW-190 nearly inverted and pulling up in a climbing turn that's designed to use the vertical as an escape route. And this is where something interesting happens. The German pilot is trying to use his fighter's strengths, its climbing ability, its vertical performance, to escape from the Tempest's superior turn rate. It's a sound, tactical move. Under normal circumstances, the FW-190 would simply outclimb the Tempest and disappear into the blue. But Carver is no longer thinking about normal circumstances. He's thinking about the engagement 2 weeks ago, about the principles of compressibility, about the way that speed and altitude interact with aerodynamic forces in ways that are not always obvious. He continues to follow the German fighter through the climbing turn, losing energy gradually as altitude increases. The airspeed indicator is dropping, 5 and 20 miles per hour, 480, 450, 420. They're reaching a point where the traditional advantages begin to matter less, where the fight is being decided more by altitude and position than by raw speed and G-force capability. The German pilot, anticipating that he's successfully separated from his pursuer, begins to level out. He's climbing to altitude now, reaching a point where the thin air will make a horizontal turn more difficult for both aircraft. But he's also assuming that Carver will maintain a following position and gradually fall behind as the Tempest loses the battle against altitude and the thinning air. What Carver does instead is to roll inverted and push the stick forward. It's not a radical maneuver, just a simple recovery from the climb into a descent, but the psychological effect on the German pilot is immediate. He whips his head around, trying to understand what the Tempest is doing, and realizes too late that Carver has initiated a dive that will quickly compress the range between them. The Tempest dives toward the FW-190, accelerating as altitude is traded for speed. The German pilot has a few options, none of them good. He can try to outdive Carver and get back to his home base before the Tempest catches up. He can try to level out and accept a firing pass that will likely result in damage or loss of the aircraft. Or he can try to turn the tables on Carver and use the Tempest dive as an opportunity to reposition for a shot of his own. The German chooses the third option. He rolls hard to the right and pulls back on the stick, attempting to turn inside Carver's dive trajectory and get a deflection shot at the Tempest. It's a mistake, and Carver knows it the instant the German begins the maneuver. The FW-190, slowing down as it tries to turn, loses the energy advantage that altitude had given it. Carver, diving hard and still accelerating, can actually cut across the German's turn radius. It's a competition of geometry and physics, and the Tempest's speed has won it. Carver adjusts his aim point, firing from a point where he can actually cut across the turning radius of the German fighter. The tracers arc through the air, and one of them catches the FW-190's right wing. The German fighter's wing is damaged, but it doesn't slow the aircraft down immediately. What it does do is make the aircraft harder to control, and at the high speed Carver is traveling at, any change in control response can be catastrophic. Carver closes to within 100 meters, then 50. The German is trying to evade, but Carver has achieved the kind of tactical position that fighter pilots dream about. A point where he has the German aircraft totally lined up in his sights, and the German has no way to escape without accepting damage. Carver fires again, a more deliberate burst this time, aiming at the fuselage of the FW-190. The rounds connect, and Carver sees smoke beginning to stream from the German's engine cowling. The German pilot doesn't hesitate. He pushes the stick forward, standing the FW-190 on its nose, and diving toward the ground at an angle that's barely shy of vertical. It's a desperate move. The acceleration in a dive from this altitude will quickly exceed the FW-190's design limits, and the aircraft could easily depart controlled flight, but it's his only chance. Carver follows, pressing the dive harder still. The airspeed indicator climbs, 500 miles per hour, 520, 540, 560. The Tempest is beginning to shudder again, that familiar vibration that suggests the aircraft is approaching its limit. But Carver isn't pulling up this time. He's maintaining the dive, maintaining the speed, maintaining the closing rate on the German fighter. The German is forced to make a choice. He can either continue the dive and risk tearing his aircraft apart in the process, or he can begin a recovery and accept the firing pass from Carver. He chooses recovery. He pulls back on the stick, and the FW-190 begins to level out about 2,000 feet above the ground. It's not quite enough. Carver, maintaining his dive at maximum speed, passes through the German's 6 o'clock just as the FW-190 is completing its recovery turn. Carver pulls hard on the stick, and the Tempest responds by rolling up and around, coming back to a position where he can fire again. But the German pilot has had enough. The smoke streaming from his engine is becoming more pronounced, and the aircraft is losing speed. The damage that Carver's rounds inflicted is beginning to have real consequences. The German pilot doesn't even attempt another turn. Instead, he pushes the stick forward once more and dives toward the nearest patch of open ground. Carver watches as the FW-190 makes a crash landing in a field below, the aircraft skidding and bouncing across the rough terrain before coming to rest against a hedgerow. Carver can see the German pilot jumping out of the cockpit, abandoning the aircraft before it catches fire. The pilot runs toward the hedgerow, clearly intending to hide and evade capture. Yellow Flight is calling him on the radio. "Carver, you've got a confirmed kill on the 190, but we've got a 262 circling high, and it's getting ready to make a run at the bombers. You've got maybe 30 seconds before it lines up for a firing pass." Carver doesn't hesitate. He rolls the Tempest and begins to climb, trading the altitude he's just lost for a chance to intercept the jet. His engine is screaming again, the manifold pressure pushed to the limit, the fuel mixture running rich because he's not even trying to manage his fuel economy anymore. But the distance is too great. The Me-262 pilot, seeing the Tempest beginning to climb, makes the same tactical decision that the previous jet pilot made 2 weeks ago. He accelerates, pushing his throttles fully forward, and begins to climb away at an angle that will take him well above any altitude the Tempest can achieve. Except this time, Carver has learned something important from the first engagement. He's learned that chasing a jet to altitude is usually a mistake. What he needs to do is to position himself where he can make use of the Tempest's superior energy handling at lower altitudes. Carver stops climbing. Instead, he rolls the Tempest inverted and dives again, accelerating back toward the sea at an angle that's designed to position him between the 262 and the bomber stream. The jet pilot, seeing that the Tempest is diving away rather than attempting to pursue, must make a choice. Does he continue his climb and complete the intercept of the bombers, trusting that the Tempest won't be able to affect the engagement? Or does he break off his run and chase the Tempest, hoping to get a shot at it before it escapes to sea? The German chooses the first option. The Me-262 continues its climb, its nose pointed toward the bomber formation, its cannons ready to fire at the vulnerable bombers. It's at this point that Carver realizes what's happening. The jet is committed to its run at the bombers. It's not going to be distracted by the Tempest. The only way to prevent the 262 from getting a firing pass at the bombers is to ensure that the jet cannot safely continue its intercept. Carver makes another decision that some might call brave and others might call insane. He begins to climb again, not toward the 262, but toward a point where his flight path and the jet's flight path will intersect at approximately the same time and altitude. It's a game of three-dimensional geometry, a calculation made in the span of seconds that involves distance, speed, acceleration, and the changing performance of both aircraft as they climb toward altitude. The Me-262 pilot sees the Tempest flight path and realizes what's happening. The Tempest pilot is going to be in a position to fire at him just as he's lining up for his firing pass at the bombers. It's not a good situation for the jet. The 262's guns will tear the Tempest apart if Carver gets within range, but the Tempest will also be in a position where it can force the jet to break its attack, spoil its aim, or risk a mid-air collision. The jet pilot makes a final decision. At the last possible moment, he brakes hard to the left, abandoning his attack run and accepting that he will not get a firing pass at the bombers today. The two aircraft pass within what can't be more than 200 meters of each other, and Carver gets a momentary glimpse of the 262's cockpit. The German pilot's face is visible for just an instant, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. And then the jet is above the Tempest, climbing away into the blue, its pilot pushing the throttles to full military power and accelerating toward altitude. Carver doesn't pursue. He's learned that lesson. Instead, he maintains a gentle climb, positioning himself between the bombers and the jet's potential return path. The 262 pilot, having been denied his first firing pass and now aware that the Tempest pilot is willing to use unconventional tactics to spoil his attack, makes the decision that many German pilots have been making in recent weeks when faced with determined Allied opposition. He accelerates toward the horizon, climbing to altitude, and heads back toward his home base. The engagement is over, the bombers are safe. Yellow flight reforms, and Carver receives congratulations from the other pilots for his work. But Carver himself is aware that what just happened was not really a victory in any traditional sense. He didn't shoot down the 262, he didn't even damage it. What he did was to exploit the jet's limitations at certain altitudes and flight profiles, and he used that exploitation to deny the jet a firing pass at the bombers. It's the kind of tactical innovation that wins wars in incremental ways, not through heroic actions, but through understanding your own aircraft's strengths and your opponent's weaknesses, and combining that knowledge with the willingness to take calculated risks. The debrief after the mission is more detailed than the first one. The intelligence officers are particularly interested in the encounter with the 262, and they pepper Carver with questions about the jet's behavior, its performance, its tactical profile. What you're describing, says Major Ashford, the intelligence officer, is a pattern of exploitation. You're not trying to beat the jet in a traditional air combat engagement. You're trying to put yourself in a position where the jet's strengths become irrelevant and its weaknesses become apparent. Exactly, Carver says. The 262 is built to operate at altitude, at high speed with limited maneuverability. In that envelope, it's superior to the Tempest. But if you can force the engagement into a different envelope, lower altitude, slower speed, turning fight, then the balance of advantage shifts. The 262 becomes more vulnerable. So, the key, Hemsworth says, thinking out loud, is to not let the jet fight on its terms. We need to use our strengths and their weaknesses, which means, Carver says, not chasing them to altitude, not trying to outrun them in a pure speed contest at high altitude, but rather finding the conditions where our aircraft performs better and forcing them to fight there. The CO listens to this exchange and then leans back in his chair. I want this information distributed to the other squadrons. If this is a pattern that Carver has discovered, then other pilots need to be aware of it. We need to be using our aircraft to the best possible effect. Over the following weeks, the tactical approach that Carver has pioneered begins to spread through the RAF's fighter units operating over Normandy. Not every pilot has the skill or the nerve to execute these tactics, but enough of them do that the air war begins to shift subtly. The German jets are still formidable, still capable of inflicting damage on the Allied air forces, but they're no longer the complete masters of the air that they once seemed to be. Carver flies another 5 combat missions over Normandy, and on each one he encounters German fighters, but never again the same 262 pilot that he faced on that first encounter 2 weeks earlier. Maybe that pilot was shot down by someone else. Maybe he was pulled back to a different sector of the front. Maybe he was lost in an accident or mechanical failure. Carver will never know. But the lessons of those two encounters, the first where Carver pushed his aircraft to the absolute limit of its design envelope in a dive, and the second where he used position and altitude management to spoil an attack. Those lessons have been learned and internalized by Carver and by every other pilot who heard the story. The air war over Normandy continues to grind on for months after that. The Germans are slowly pushed back. Their air base is overrun or bombed out of effectiveness. The Luftwaffe's presence over the beachhead becomes less and less frequent as the summer turns to fall and then to winter. The Me-262 program continues, and the jets will eventually become operational in significant numbers, but by then the war is already decided. The Allies have the numbers, the industrial capacity, and the will to win. Germany does not. Carver survives the war. He'll go on to have a long career in the RAF, and he'll fly jet aircraft once they become the standard fighter. But he'll never forget the lessons of those two encounters over Normandy, and he'll never forget the moment when he pushed a piston-engine fighter to the absolute limit of its design envelope and discovered that sometimes the difference between success and failure is simply a matter of understanding the rules well enough to break them. Years later, when historians come to write about the air war over Normandy, they'll reference his